Everyone. All right, so finally, here we are, and we're talking about our final book for the semester. As I mentioned, it's a book I've never read. It's an interesting book, Rene Girard's Violence and the Sacred. And Rene Girard is, as I think I mentioned, a French anthropologist, philosopher of social sciences, and historian. So it's a major departure from a lot of the material that we've looked at over the course of the semester. It approaches, ethics from a very different perspective. But I think it's interesting to conclude with the sort of this anthropological, deep historical view. And I think, part of the reason why I wanted to end with this book was to think about, social dynamics and the relation between the individual and the community, which we've examined from many different angles, from really sort of fundamentally different perspective, an anthropological perspective. And what what Girard is up to in Violence and the Sacred is this attempt to explain primitive religion, right? Rene Girard's Violence and the Sacred is about sacrifice and primitive religion, right? And what sacrifice and religion tell us about violence. So I think what's interesting is, sorry, I just got distracted by my phone. What's interesting is we think of ethics as being a set of questions about our behavior. What should we do and what shouldn't we do? What is the right way to act? What kind of action is going to make us happy? So generally, the economy of ethics is the individual, right? Restraint of the individual. And we think of ethics then as a question of individual choice. Now, in the last several books that we've been reading, that has not been the case. But what is ethics in its original sense, right? Even before Aristotle begins talking about ethics. Ethics refers to habit, right? Ethos, habit and custom. Custom is directly related to ritual, to social behavior. Now, we haven't talked about this as much as we could have, but when we think about what shapes an individual's habits and the customs that one follows in one's life, of course, these are largely, produced by the larger society, by larger culture. And so when we are thinking about sort of what the ethical possibilities are for any individual, we should always locate those possibilities within a culture, a society. Right? And therefore, the ethics that pertains to the individual is going to be at some level uh, a function of the ethos, the habits, customs, traditions, and rituals of the society in which the individual, it lives. So I think in thinking about anthropology as a perspective on ethics or philosophical anthropology, or philosophy of social sciences, what we see is uh, a realm of ethics that is beyond the control of the individual, uh, a kind of large scale historical ethics that dictates to some extent individual ethics. Uh, so Girard's Girard's topic is violence and the sacred, and he's examining both of these, violence and the sacred, primarily, as anthropologists tend to do, uh, through the lens of quote unquote primitive cultures. Right? And Girard is pretty critical of the idea of primitive cultures, of primitivism, the idea that there is a fundamental improvement over the course of history. So Girard belongs to sort of critical tradition that is responding to early anthropologists. He mentions a few of them, right? Levi Strauss, Malinowski, and others that Girard is responding to. And this early anthropology uh, is primitivist, right? It is analyzing primitive culture and trying to understand primitive culture in connection to our culture, but with the sort of assumption that modern contemporary culture is higher than primitive culture, right? It is more advanced, uh, advanced both technologically and morally. And so Girard, along with other anthropologists in the 60s and 70s, are critical of this early anthropological concept of primitivism and the concept of advancement. Right, societies organize themselves differently, but against what standard would you measure a society in order to say that one society is better than another? Right, uh, going against that sort of Hegelian concept of history as development, history as progression. The anthropological view of the mid 20th century is there is no advancement or development through history. There's only change and difference. So that we can't say, 20th century American society uh, is more advanced with respect to uh, ancient Greek society, right? That the society itself is more advanced. The society is more technological, and technology, advances certain aims like efficiency or comfort. So we could say a society, technological society like our own, values things like efficiency and comfort more, perhaps, than the society of ancient Greece. Uh, but right, we can't say that those values are necessarily inherently better or more advanced. Right? Uh, if anything, the measure of a society would be the extent to which it is stable. Right? The measure of society is stability. And as long as one's values and the traditions that maintain those values are stable, then it is a successful society. So that the measure of success comes from within the society itself. It doesn't make sense to compare one society, one historical era to another. Uh, it's apples and oranges. And so when Girard is analyzing these ancient societies, beginning with an analysis uh, of ancient Greece, even before sort of classical era uh, of Plato and Socrates and the great tragedians. Um, early ancient Greece, where human sacrifice was still alive and well. What Girard is, One of the things that Girard is interested in doing is to illustrate uh, that the practices of those ancient cultures, alien and bizarre and in some cases immoral as they may seem to us from within our society, were, you know, um, were not morally deficient, and were not, closer, as it were, to nature, closer to being animalistic, closer to being animal-like, but were, you know, heterogeneous uh, systems of value, different cultures that followed their own logic and were measured against their own capacity for stability, right? And so one of the key concepts here is this concept of human sacrifice. And we tend to look at human sacrifice as the example par excellence of the primitive mind, primitive society, and of the animalistic, confused, and you know um, unscientific, and therefore essentially immoral practices of of these uh, of these ancient civilizations, or undeveloped civilizations. So we see human sacrifice and we say that's primitive, that's animalistic, right? And in the uh, first couple chapters, actually throughout the book, one thing Girard is trying to do is explain what sacrifice is and how sacrifice works. And the way that we understand sacrifice is as a part of religion, right? And sacrifice is connected to religion, whether it's human sacrifice or animal sacrifice, or another kind of sacrifice, right? We just came through Easter, right? You have um, Lent, uh, which is sacrificing of certain certain things for a period of time. Of course, we have Ramadan, uh, also, which is a month-long sacrifice of certain habits like eating during the day. Uh, and you have religious fasting. Um, in the Buddhist tradition, there are sort of various forms of sacrifice, the painfulness of hours-long meditation. Um, we can think of religious sacrifice as related to any kind of self-inflicted pain that is done for the purpose of becoming closer to God, or attaining some kind of spiritual enlightenment. Sacrifice and religion are deeply connected, right? Uh, and in ancient civilizations, uh, a very common form of sacrifice, and I shouldn't keep saying just in ancient civilizations, because sacrifice is a form of religious rite that is still practiced in certain places today. It's not just an ancient phenomenon, and it has been practiced right around the globe, throughout the world. It's an extremely common form of religious rite. Now, Girard spends a little time in chapter 1 talking about uh, the reason that we discount uh, the validity of sacrifice. And the argument that he makes is roughly that our inability to understand sacrifice, our inability to understand human sacrifice or animal sacrifice, or any kind of major sacrifice along those lines, is related to not per se our relation to sacrifice itself, but instead our relationship to religion, our relationship to religion in the West, in Europe. That the extent to which we have lost the ability to understand sacrifice is the extent to which we've lost the ability to understand religion, uh, which is an interesting claim. Right? Now, why do we not understand sacrifice? What is the nature of our confusion or misunderstanding? Girard thinks we discount sacrifice because it doesn't have a scientific perspective. It's not grounded in any kind of scientific knowledge. Uh, what does this mean? Sacrifice we understand as a kind of exchange, right? A kind of mechanism or process, right? A barter with the gods or with God. I sacrifice my sacrificial victim in order to appease the gods or in exchange for something that I want from the gods. Right? I sacrifice my sacrificial victim in order to have peace in my state, in my city, in my home. Right? God bestows peace, harmony, and what are peace and harmony? Justice. Right? God bestows justice in exchange for the sacrifice. This is extremely important for Girard. Right? God bestows justice, and the sacrifice is done in the name of justice. Right? It's done in exchange for justice. So, right, just to step back and zoom out a little bit, right, what we find in this initial analysis of sacrifice is that it is a cultural level phenomenon. It is not, a question of individual action, but of, or rather, it is a question of individual action, but the individual action, the way that the individual knows how to find justice, harmony, and thus peace and happiness, is dictated by tradition, by culture, and that tradition is followed blindly. Right? That tradition is the ethics of the individual. The individual knows what to do through tradition. Tradition does the work for the individual. Tradition provides justice for the individual. Right? Now, that tradition, which is sacrifice, let's, as Girard does, think of this in the context of ancient Greek civilization, right? The Minoan civilization, say. the Minoan civilization, which is one of the earliest Greek civilizations, where we get the myth of the Minotaur and other Greek classics. Uh, the tradition of human sacrifice is not understood by the individual. When the individual, right, sacrifices a human in order to get justice, the logic of the act is non-rational. How can logic be non-rational? Well, right, the motivation, the kind of knowledge and understanding that leads a person to sacrifice is not, in this sense, scientific. I can't explain how or why my sacrifice will restore order, right? But that is the tradition. We have faith in the tradition, right? And it is the faith that is the key to the peace and to the justice. Sacrifice, human sacrifice, and religion are intimately bound together. Right? Girard spends some time on this in chapter 4 in particular, where he's talking about essentially a chicken and egg question. Right? One theory of the origin of religion is that sacrifice predates religion. Sacrifice as a way of finding justice is what gives birth to religion. Girard is not sure about this, right? But it's an interesting theory. There would be a manner of finding justice through sacrifice that predates religion and which gives birth to religion, right? As Girard puts it, the accumulation of sacrificial victims comes to take on a unified personality, right? And this unified personality is a god, or the god. And it is that unified personality that provides the justice and the peace. We'll come back to that. For now, I'm struggling, right, with this idea of tradition and faith providing the rationale for sacrifice. And we'll come back to, potential explanations for what a genuine rationale might be in the first human sacrifices. If in the first human sacrifices there is some rationale, generally in cultures that have human sacrifice, the rationale is not, doesn't meet sort of the standards of reason and logic that 20th century philosopher would demand. It's based on tradition. When we, 20th century philosophers, then butt up against sacrifice. We view it as irrational, right? Um, it's irrational to try and barter with God. And in fact, right, this is one of the earliest ethical texts, sort of explicitly ethical texts. Plato's Euthyphro is, has an extended section about sacrifice and if it makes any sense to sacrifice things to the gods. Right? It's interesting to think that, as Girard talks about, even in Plato's time, there was probably some amount of human sacrifice still happening. And so human sacrifice was a cultural sort of holdover from a previous historical era that was being fought against even in classical Athens in Plato's time. And it's interesting to think about the argument against pagan religion, Plato's argument against Greek religion as connected to ending human sacrifice potentially. An argument against human sacrifice. In any case, right, rationality has been against human sacrifice for thousands of years. And the more rationality replaces religion, the less understanding we have of human sacrifice, of sacrifice in general. So that our inability to understand sacrifice is not because sacrifice in itself is illogical, even, but instead that it is incompatible with a scientific, rational worldview. It is compatible with a religious worldview and a religious culture. Religion understands sacrifice. When philosophers don't understand sacrifice, it's because they belong to the tradition of reason, of rationalism, not with a capital R, but with a lowercase r. And lowercase r rationalism is a grand historical movement that begins with classical Athens. In most stories, we can debate that certainly, and is a counter movement to a religious world. It's a pre-historical, pre-civilizational religious world. And that is the world to which human sacrifice belongs. So the first thing to understand about sacrifice is that it is a form of seeking justice. It is a form of doing ethics, doing politics, and even a proto-example of the law. This is one of Girard's most important arguments, that sacrifice is law. Sacrifice provides justice just as law does. Law is rational, based on individual action, universal principles. sacrifice is religious, based on substitution, as we mentioned in class a little bit, uh, and on faith in tradition, uh, based in community bonding through tradition. Now, how is it that sacrifice creates justice? The argument is that through sacrifice, through designating a sacrificial victim and murdering that victim, in fact, violence is reduced. Social violence is reduced. We look at human sacrifice and say that's the product of a violent culture, right? A culture that values violence and wants to promote violence in some way. And in fact, Girard's arguing the violence of human sacrifice is actually a form of anti-violence. The sacrificial victim is a stand-in, a substitute, chosen according to certain traditional values. Right, and this process of choosing the sacrificial victim is important, extremely important. Right, you have to choose the kind of victim that is going to reduce violence, not promote it. So, what is sacrificial? What kind of violence is sacrificial violence a substitute for? And who does the sacrificial victim substitute for? Girard's argument is that human sacrifice is specifically about preventing revenge and preventing feuds and rivalries. I think this is an interesting argument because his point is that there is a kind of violence that begets more violence. And in fact, violence, when left to its own devices, as it were, violence, when it's not controlled, reproduces itself like fire. Right? It consumes everything it touches. Violence threatens to overtake entire cultures, communities, families, tribes, etc., the whole world. Violence produces more violence. When, we can think of famous feuds, Hatfields and McCoys, the Lancasters and the Yorks, right? These famous feuds. What is a feud? It begins with an initial act of violence. That violence is then returned with more violence. Right? You killed my son, I'm going to go kill your son. Violence is returned. Violence is reciprocated. Violence is always reciprocal in this sense. But when, I've killed your son and you've killed my son, that's not the end of the violence. So, I think this is the key insight, really, that the violence continues. There is no now we're even, right? There is no sense of justice in violence itself, in uncontrolled violence. I've killed your son, you've killed my son, but now you've killed my son. I don't care that I've killed your son, right? I killed your son for some other reason, but now you've killed my son, and I want to retaliate, right, for this crime. And so I kill another one of your sons, right? And then you retaliate again, so that it is a perpetuating system, a self-accumulating system. Uh, and that is the real danger of violence. That it consumes everything it touches, that it grows when left unregulated. Because violence, yeah. How do we prevent that feud, that cycle of violence? Girard thinks this is what sacrifice is. When the violence becomes retaliatory, when there are feuds, when there's a kind of violence that threatens to consume the entire culture, that's when sacrifice is needed. I think this is interesting. I just want to mention one more point about this nature of violence to consume everything it touches. Right? In chapter 4, Girard spends some time talking about, or maybe it's actually in chapter 1, excuse me. Girard spends some time talking about violence as a contaminant, violence as a contagion, right? He talks about, when there's a violent act, everyone's first reaction is to flee. Right? Now, of course, this is partly to avoid having violence done to oneself or get drawn into the immediate violence. But Girard says it's also, and perhaps even primarily, an attempt to avoid retaliatory violence, right? To avoid repercussions for having been contaminated by that violence, right? When something goes wrong, right? If there's, you're at a party and something violent happens, you want to get out of there. You never want to have anyone know that you're part of that party, that you had anything to do with it. Because if anyone seeking retaliation for that violence does some digging around, right, you might be implicated, right? And even if you're not, even if you weren't party to the violence, participating in it, you could get caught up in it, right? So when you think about, feuds at the political level, where your allegiance implicates you in violence. Think of World War I as an example of, the contamination of violence. Now, none of the, kings or leaders were that unhappy about having to go to war in World War I. That's a different case, perhaps. We'll come back to that. But right, allegiance draws you into violence. It's one of the things that allegiance is. Right? You have my back when I'm the subject of violence. And so violence is, right, but Girard wants to, I think, turn this on its head a little bit. Right? Say, violence is that which binds us together, in fact, in ways that we want and don't want. And when violence happens, we are bound to the other people that we're party to that violence in whatever way. We're contaminated by that violence. Guilt by association. Right? And in this way, violence threatens to consume an entire society. Right? And this is what civil war is, essentially, where there is no way of being except on one side of a violent war, right? Party to violence in some way. How do you then prevent feuding and this unchecked violence, uncontrolled violence, from contaminating everyone and overtaking society as a whole? Right? The way to do this is by controlling the violence, by taking control of violence. And this is what human sacrifice is about. Right? Exerting control over violence, sanctifying violence, returning, or rather bringing kind of justice to violence. And that justice is found in the communal act of sacrificing someone innocent. Right? Sacrificial victim cannot be one of the two feuding sides. Right? And this is because that would mean that tradition, society, culture has taken one side in this feud. Instead, to end the feud, society does not take one side, but rather, right, attempts to placate both sides by substituting each for a third, this innocent sacrificial victim. And so often sacrificial victims were, the among the healthiest and best. So one way, so they would be young men and women, even children, right? Teenagers, strong, beautiful, the most beloved, right, perhaps. And the way that we often interpret that is to say, well, that's you have to give the best to your God, right? If you sacrifice to God, but you sacrifice, an old person who's about to die, what have you? Your sacrifice is much smaller. If you give someone who's very sick to God, right? That's not a meaningful sacrifice either. I mean, meaningful, of course, right? But it is not showing as much respect as could be shown. And so we understand, right, that sacrifice is someone strong and beautiful and young because it demonstrates the size of the sacrifice. But we can also understand this as, why choose the young, beautiful, strong person? Because what is at risk is not, right, it is the culture itself, not either side. Right? It's not that one side is going to win, it's that culture as a whole is going to lose. Right? And so by sacrificing, right, one almost gets out ahead of that retaliatory violence, of that cycle of violence, and says, we're ending this and we're going to make it transcendental. I'm going to say uh, we recognize the danger to the whole, the collective, the group. And in order to placate this desire for violence, this bloodthirst, we're going to sacrifice one of our own who's unrelated to this particular feud because the culture is more important. Right? So, in the first place, substituting the true subject of violence in the feud for this innocent victim is a way of ending the feud by providing an outlet for bloodlust, right? Providing a sanctified and permitted object of bloodlust in the sacrificial victim, which, as Girard says, provides a kind of catharsis to society. Right? In a feud, in escalating violence, right, there is this need for catharsis, for a final victory. But that final victory is always denied in feuding, right? Because violence escalates. So it has to be through something external to the violence that one finds this catharsis. The way to end that escalating violence, then, is for there to be a separate and external instance of violence that can be controlled as a final catharsis for both feuding parties. So this is the justice that's achieved through this catharsis. Everyone achieves a kind of collective victory. Now, this form of controlling violence, right? Because everything about the human sacrifice is controlled. That's another key to it. It doesn't just create this catharsis and act as an outlet for bloodlust. It also reinstates control, right? And it establishes a regular way of controlling violence. Regular sacrifice is an important outlet for normal human violence. This is another key religious idea. The control of violence is transcendental, right? What that means is that, in the first place, it is external to the logic of the feud, external to the cause and effect that leads to the cycle of violence. So that, I think this is a really interesting thought. Right? What is transcendence? That which escapes the causality of the world, that which escapes the the change, the deterioration of the physical world. And analogous exactly in sacrifice. Right? There is the cause and effect of a feud, Then there's the sacrificial violence that happens outside of that cycle of violence, and which allows those within the cycle of violence themselves to transcend out of that causality. So that in the first instance of human sacrifice, there's already this form of transcendence, transcendence out of causation. And this establishes, right, a way of escaping the causality of violence, not just through feuding, uh, violence delivered back and forth, but also the uh, the violent urge that is in human beings, right? The fact that we are caused to sometimes do violent things, right? Humans are sometimes violent. It is in our nature sometimes to be violent, as it's in any animal's nature to sometimes be violent. And by channeling that urge to violence, controlling it and directing it toward certain outlet, sacrifice, that urge to violence can also be transcended, where no longer are we as individuals at the mercy of our violent whims, but instead, right, we've learned to direct them, to channel them, and control them through sanctified outlets. Religion is largely, about providing these sanctified outlets for violence. This transcendence is then the foundation for tradition. The ritual involved in sacrifice is sort of cultural moment, religious moment. How is the rite of sacrifice practiced? Who is sacrificed? How are they sacrificed? By whom? And in all these questions, tradition is built, culture is built. And because it is a culture of transcending out of the causality of violence, it is that tradition naturally is understood as religion, as God, right? As that which is able to exist outside the world, that which is greater than the world, where the world is understood as the cycle of violence. Yeah, no, to put it bluntly and overly simply, we could say that Girard's theory is, right, religion through sacrifice is essentially a mechanism of regulating the phenomenon of revenge through this transcendence. Now, this is all connected to, I just want to mention this quickly. This also explains the other key element to religion, which is control of the sexual urge to violence, the urge to sex. And the argument is, right, this is a very common argument, that violence and sexuality are intimately connected. Girard has this interesting moment in chapter 4 where he says, uh, sexuality uh, is shameful in religion, not because sexuality in itself is shameful, but instead because of sexuality's connection to violence. Right? That the reason religion is concerned with sexuality, when it is because of sexuality's connection to violence, right? And thinking about revenge, we'd also add jealousy, desire as key causes of violence, motivators for violence, reasons why feuds might begin. Right. So religion controls violence through sacrifice. And it does this by introducing violence. One of the key thoughts, I keep saying that, right? One of the key thoughts. Well, yes, one of the key thoughts here is what I would call the autoimmunity of sacrificial violence. Right? Like an autoimmune disease, right? It reacts to itself, or like a vaccine, right? To make it topical. Violence works like a vaccine. A little bit of it is good for you, but too much of it will kill you. Right? Through sacrificial violence, society is vaccinated against the contagion of violence in general. Now, first of all, I think this is interesting when we think about Kantian view, Kantian vision of a world with no violence, right? A world completely without violence. Any kind of utopian, vision of a completely peaceful world. And I don't know if there's any way to answer this question. I think it's unanswerable. But from Girard's perspective, from this perspective, from certainly the sacrificial perspective, violence is unavoidable and inevitable. And you see this theory also mirrored in Sigmund Freud will say something along these lines in Civilization and Its Discontents, which is something Girard mentions also. Perhaps it's true. Violence is unavoidable. There will always be some form of violence. Humans are animals. Animals have violent instincts occasionally, and the best we can hope to do is regulate and control that violence. If that's the case, then this model of sort of vaccination is a kind of ingenious one, right? In that it allows for violence. It doesn't say violence is universally immoral, universally wrong. And it says violence is inevitable. And in order to control it, we need to regulate it, right? Allow for certain moments of violence, but in ways that are not going to destroy society. So it's um, you know, using violence against violence. And I think, well, let's then compare sacrificial culture to a culture of law and the religious culture of sacrifice to this rational culture uh, that begins perhaps in ancient Greece, perhaps with modern Europe, however you want to define it. 20th century philosophy. One of Girard's arguments is we believe that we have overcome sacrificial violence, and we believe that we have a more rational and better approach to justice through law. Right? And having just discussed prisons, this is maybe a familiar argument, or connects up with Angela Davis's argument in Are Prisons Obsolete? Girard's argument is, in fact, we have not at all ended the violence of the violence associated with justice. Right? Our justice system is not expunged of violence. There's still violence used in the name of justice. However, the justice system of law, is not centered around the community, not centered around tradition per se, and is not about escaping the cycle of violence or revenge. But instead, right, the law is a kind of subtle and even subconscious form of revenge in which one side of a dispute is taken by the law, and the violence of justice is doled out by one side in a feud, in a dispute. Right now, it's not a feud. Right, the feud is not between government and the people, but the logic of revenge, right, in which the criminal has done something to the state, broken a law, right? And then justice is the violence that is done to the lawbreaker. Thrown in prison, maybe executed, tortured, whatever it might be. The punishment is a form of violence, and it has the structure, form of revenge, in that it's retaliatory. So, I think it's interesting that in this comparison, the sacrificial culture is perhaps, arguably, if it's in fact true that sacrifice led to control of violence, and that the cycle of violence within communities was removed by sacrifice, then we might speculate that that is in fact a better method of finding justice than this cycle of violence that we just saw in the discussion of prison industrial complex, and the system of law, which is still founded in retaliation and revenge. Not to say human sacrifice is a better natural ethic or ethos at all. It's just an interesting thought. Now, what's really interesting is, I think, uh, in this system of law, uh, which is founded in revenge, again, uh, Girard says we lose control of violence, or we're at the risk of losing control of violence. He's writing in 1972. In France, but right, 72, he's responding to violence around the world, as well as the student uprising of 1968, internal unrest, as well as international tension. Again, a time not so different from our own in certain respects. And I think the insight that's interesting is, especially coming back to Angela Davis, when there is no sanctified outlet for violence, when violence is controlled by society, when it's not allowed and regulated by society, then it becomes, as he says, unlimited. Right? It becomes this all-consuming phenomena, as we saw, right, with feuding. And so obviously, it's interesting, right? It's an interesting thought. And when we think about sanctioned outlets for violence, I think we could think about war. Right? War is an example of a kind of sanctioned outlet for violence. Soldier is excused from the normal moral requirements of a civilian. Right? And it's that exclusion that signifies, right, the sanctity. This is an important point that I should have mentioned earlier. Forgive me, but I think it's worth mentioning still. That vaccination model of violence that regulates violence depends upon the sacred, right? Because it's only sacred violence that has the ability to regulate and control normal violence, right? Vengeful violence. And that sacredness comes from the ability to do violence without retribution. That is to say, it is sanctified. The normal causality is broken. And the one who commits the violence becomes godlike. Human morality is not applicable. So the big idea, here's the big idea. in order to have functioning human morality, you have to have uh, the sacred. And the sacred has to be excluded from normal morality. Sacred person and the sacred ritual are able to break all taboos, all moral norms. And when the breaking of those taboos and norms is ritualized, is turned into tradition for everyone in a culture, then, and only then, are the taboos and moral norms respected and actually followed in normal everyday life. So, there are lots of examples of this. Girard gives several examples of this. There always has to be some exclusion to the rule in order for the rule to stand. So he talks about the rights of a king. He spent a lot of time in chapter 4 talking about it. And in many cultures, right, the king is allowed to do whatever he wants. Now we interpret this as right corruption, the corruption of power, and certainly in a materialistic, scientific, rational world, that's a correct interpretation. But in a religious world, the leader is, again, a representation of the community, the embodiment of tradition, something transcendental, and therefore outside the normal causality in which morality operates. So the king, is permitted to commit, for example, incest. Incest, one of the most universal and most strongly felt taboos. And throughout history, there are examples of royalty doing inbreeding, committing incest. We mentioned the British royalty, right? There was plenty of it there. That's sort of the caricatured in Game of Thrones. But you have it, in royalty around the world, in many, many cultures. Right? For royalty, the taboo of incest doesn't apply. Right? People accept that the royals commit incest, right? And so it's not corruption in that case. It's not immorality. It's the prerogative of the one who holds the sacred space, the one who is sacred, right? The one who's sacred provides justice, right? Is transcendental, able to transcend all of that. We see, examples of this throughout culture, not just in monarchy. Right? For example, Halloween, Carnival. These are examples of what the sociologist Lewis Hyde calls dirt rituals, in which all of the cultural traditions are broken. Right? What happens on Halloween? Everyone dresses up like a devil. Everyone dresses up like a monster, right? And behaves badly. That's what Carnival is also. That's what Mardi Gras is, right? Before Lent. Uh, before you impose the rule, before the rule is set in stone or set in place, there has to be this sort of sacred and sanctified uh, release of all those energies. Right? The ability to respect the law requires the existence of some sacred element beyond the law, in which there is a regulated, sanctified moment for that which is against the law to exist. Um, right. So again, yeah. Now, I think that's all I'm going to say for today because I'm losing my voice like crazy. Uh, but I think one of the takeaways here is not obviously that human sacrifice needs to come back, right? But rather that uh, the concept of universalism and the scientism that's based in this rational universalism, which we've seen throughout the semester, uh, from this perspective, is in fact one of the causes of uncontrollable violence. Within a system of universal rationalism, uh, in which morality is conceived as absolute, as what is good and must never be done. And I think we can find some version of that in most of the ethical theories that we've seen, certainly in Kant, certainly in, I think, John Stuart Mill, less so in Aristotle, importantly. In all of these strict ethics, which treat ethics simply as a question of individual choice. The individual must never do this, or as kind of map for a completely peaceful, unviolent society. Um, that kind of ethics isn't possible. And in fact, that universal rationalism is cause of uncontrollable violence. Ethics should, from this perspective, have a theory of violence that doesn't try to eradicate it, but rather finds ways to ritualize it so that it brings the community together, it binds the community to itself through this ritual, and controls, therefore, violent impulses outside of this ritual. And I think it's interesting how difficult it is to imagine in ethics, let alone politics, that would sanction this. We can understand it religiously, but not rationally. The closest thing we have in the United States is probably football. Right? And so I guess my thought is, and Girard's thought, the impulse is to say violence is inherently bad. And any theory that would advocate for the beneficial effects of violence is an irresponsible and immoral theory, and an incorrect one. But I think it's interesting to consider that a theory that wants to make any instance of violence uh, inexcusable and to completely eradicate violence uh, from society is, in fact, the more violent theory, the more destructive one. And that when we don't embrace a kind of violence, we get this unlimited violence. All right. That's all I can say about that for now. I will see you on Monday.